Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel Mike Stars.
Hello, good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all here to this evening, and first I'd like to thank the Allegheny HYP Club, incredibly accommodating. You may not know it from the background, but it's such a neat historic building in heart of downtown, and the club has just been incredibly helpful in getting this all set up and coordinated. Also like to thank Rob Jackson, the Pittsburgh Petroleum Club, for sponsoring this event. I think Rob said something to the words of, hey, it's going to be on defense, not energy. And he said, energy is defense. So thanks, Rob. So for you in attendance as well, it's great to come here on a Friday evening in August. But storm thankfully didn't hit us as hard as we could, but this is really a special night, I think, in that how we're going to talk about things is perhaps a little bit different than what we're seeing in the media, or even maybe talking with our neighbors and friends. And I don't want to suggest that politics is dirty and bad, and that policy is noble and pure. Actually, people in politics make policy, and vice versa. The two are inseparable. But we're going to try to focus tonight on ideas and concepts and dialogue. And so we ask you to recognize that in the spirit of the question and answer session that we do after Dave McCormick's responses and remarks. So I think it's also fitting that we're doing this during the second week of the Olympics. There's this sense, not that the world has gotten more peaceful or more calm, but who doesn't feel a little bit of sense of relief when you see South Koreans and North Koreans posing together on selfies, or young athletes from Ukraine competing in what they're great at rather than on the battlefront in a desperate and difficult war. So after we hear the opening remarks from Dave, I have a couple prepared questions. We'll move over to the chairs, we'll ask some prepared questions, and then if you saw as you came in, there are an opportunity for you to write down your own questions. So write down questions, there's a table in the back, and then we'll bring them up this way. That way we get to as many questions as possible. So all it just says on there is if you'd like to put your name or your organization down, you're welcome to. If you just want to write your question down, that's great. But I'd ask you to do that fairly quickly or pass them back if you could to get that started. Okay, so let me introduce our speaker tonight. So our speaker tonight is the Honorable Dave McCormick. And it's great to welcome Dave to the Allegheny HYP tonight. After graduating from West Point, he served in the 82nd Airborne Division and later deployed to the Gulf War as a combat engineer. Many servicemen and women who volunteer in the military think very deeply as they're getting ready to go or as we're over there, what it is that we're trying to defend. And I know for me it was Pennsylvania when it was my time to go. And I'm sure it was the same for Dave. You just have this sense of you have America and the ideals and the Constitution and your friends and your unit, but it's also the people back home in your community. And I'm sure they felt the same way. When they put this West Point ethos on us, I mean, they pound it into you. It's not a one and done thing. You spend 4 years getting this ethos put on you. And it doesn't ever leave you. So the day that you hang up your uniform, whether you're out processing the Army or you retire from the Army, like I did, it just doesn't ever end. And I think what Dave did next is interesting. He went back to school, got his PhD in international relations, and then came back to Pittsburgh to run a successful startup. After that, he served in a variety of very senior positions in the George W. Bush administration, Undersecretary first of Commerce and Labor, also with a stint as the Deputy National Security Advisor, and really learned policy making at the federal level. Then he came from there and went to Bridgewater Associates and rose to become the CEO of that organization. I encourage you, as I was preparing for this, I read his autobiography. It's very interesting. He's written a book. He wrote a book in the 90s about how the Army was transforming after the Cold War, and so a lot of those ideas about policy are now in his new book, Superpower in Peril, and it talks really about his life experiences, but then intersperses those with what he learned as it applies to policy. And so that was what gave us this idea of doing an event on policy rather than politics, because here was a candidate who was very serious about policy. And so please join me in welcoming Dave McCormick to the stage.
Thanks, Mike, for that great introduction. Thank you all for being here on a Friday, no less. I really appreciate it. Thank you to the club for hosting. And Mike, thank you for your career of just incredible service to our country. Mike was a battalion commander in the 101st Air Assault Division, one of the great elite units of our Army, and has served admirably a career in the Army. So thank you for that, and thank you for all you're doing. And you know, it's really a perfect time, I think, when you watch the news, to be talking about our security. I'm talking to you today at a time when America is in a generational fight for global primacy, for its place in the world. And the sad fact, what frames everything I'm about to say, is that we're falling behind. And our adversaries around the world are gaining ground. And this comes down to leadership, and this speech today is going to be a lot about leadership, under the leadership of President Biden and Vice President Harris and Senator Casey. I'm going to lump them together because Senator Casey's voted 98% of the time with President Biden and Vice President Harris. But under their leadership, America's less safe. And the reason for that is the weakness that they've shown at a time when our national security is under attack around the world. And so that's what I'd like to talk about today. It's not always been that way. When I left West Point in 1987, America was winning. The communists were losing. The Soviet Empire would soon be added to the ash heap of history. And that's because Ronald Reagan, who was the president at the time, understood that the best way to achieve peace was through American strength, not weakness. Strength is what creates a peaceful world for America. But where does strength come from? It's easy to say strength, but where does it come from? Well, first, it comes from having the military power to win on the battlefield. But it also comes from having the will to use that power in defense of America and America's interest. And most important, and this is the most important thing, the thing I think we're losing, most important, a belief that America is worth fighting for. Power, will, and belief. Power, will, and belief. These are the fundamental sources of American strength. But under Biden, Harris, and Casey, all three of those things are missing. And our enemies know it. Our enemies know it. They have seen Biden lose his will and abandon Afghanistan. That was really what got me to get into the race in 2022. They knew that President Biden and Vice President Harris didn't have the courage or the will to stop the invasion of Ukraine. They witnessed how Senator Casey and Vice President Joe Biden sent coffers full of cash to Iran in 2015. And Iran smiled as Harris's radical progressive allies celebrated Hamas's horrific massacre of innocent Israelis on October 7th. And that attack was only made possible because of the money that Biden and Casey made available to that dangerous regime. Our adversaries have long understood that Biden and Casey will put the Green Crusade above military power. And they'll willingly, and this is happening as we speak, inflict devastating cuts on our military. And our enemies watch as our military faces a serious recruiting crisis, probably the most serious recruiting crisis since the creation of the all-volunteer force. And that recruiting crisis is driven by a belief because civilian leaders have politicized the uniformed military. And those services, the military, exist for one reason alone, not for political purposes, but to deter and, if necessary, fight and win our nation's wars. So our enemies are no longer waiting in the shadows for America to decline. They're on the march. They're on the march. So to restore peace and deter our enemies, America must rebuild its strength. And to do that, we must have leaders who are strong, not weak. We need leaders who prioritize military power, who don't make empty threats, and who most of all will always fight for America. Now, I've learned those lessons as a cadet at West Point and as a young lieutenant in the 82nd Airborne Division. I saw and went to war in defense of a strong, diverse, and confident America. We can see that America again if Pennsylvania sends me to Washington as its next step. Now, when I arrived at West Point in 1983, I learned the three words that became what General Douglas MacArthur called the rallying points for every cadet. We talked about this earlier today. Duty, honor, Now, I didn't grow up in the military, and I was the first Bloomsburg, PA kid to go to West Point in decades, but those words changed my life. I studied for 4 years to become an engineer and an Army officer. I was co-captain of the Army wrestling team my senior year. And just 3 years after I graduated, my unit in the 82nd Airborne Division deployed to Saudi Arabia. And I'll always remember that night, 6 or 7 months later, in February 1999, when my company of paratroopers sprinted across the Iraqi desert as part of the first wave with Apache helicopters and A-10 Warthogs flying overhead during Operation Desert Storm. In that moment, February of 1991, America stood unchallenged in the world, the strongest nation in the world. But sadly, that moment has passed. West Point and the Army baptized me in a culture of selfless service to the nation. But Kamala Harris and Bob Casey come from an opposite culture in Washington. That culture and their weak leadership has emboldened our adversaries around the world, not deterred them. Their weak leadership has eroded American military power and failed to adopt the world's greatest fighting force to a rapidly changing world. You have to adapt or you die. And their weak leadership has undermined the strength of purpose that inspires brave young men and women to put on the uniform and defend our great nation. And just to go through how we got here, it all started in Afghanistan. While the Army demands accountability, in Washington, in Biden's Washington, accountability is nowhere to be found. To this day, President Biden, Vice President Harris have not said aloud the names of the 13 fallen heroes who were killed in Kabul. Not a single senior administration official, not a one, was fired for the failures in Afghanistan. Despite desperate Afghans, we all saw it on TV, falling out of the wheel wells of those airplanes. I'll never forget that image. Despite 9,000 American citizens left to fend for themselves against the Taliban, Senator Casey said that he fully backed President Biden's decision. Now, this moment, Afghanistan sent an unmistakable message of weakness to our enemies. It was really the shot that wasn't heard or was heard around the world. Vladimir Putin heard that message, and he invaded Ukraine 6 months later. And Senator Casey directly contributed to that weakness just 1 month before Russia invaded Ukraine, when the world was watching how America would respond to Russia's massive military mobilization. Senator Casey and many other Democrats voted against imposing sanctions on Putin's Nord Stream 2 pipeline. That was like a green light. It sent a clear signal to Moscow that feckless leaders in Washington like Casey will not stand in your way. In the Middle East, Israel has faced thousands of rocket and drone attacks since the barbaric Hamas attack of October 7th. Thousands. Yet policies supported by Biden, Harris, and Casey enable the true perpetrator of these attacks and atrocities to exist, and that's Iran. The mullahs in Tehran get away with arming and funding terrorist groups on Israel's borders because weak American politicians like Casey caved to their demands time and time again. This is what weakness brings us. In 2015, Senator Casey was one of the most decisive votes, the deciding vote, in the Iran nuclear deal that provided the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism with $100 billion, which has been used for the last decade to underwrite terrorist proxies around the Middle East. And those terrorist proxies aren't just aimed at Israel, they're aimed at America. And now Casey stands by while the Biden administration withholds weapons that Israel needs to defend itself against these barbaric terrorist groups, and pro-Hamas mobs terrorize our cities and our college campuses right here in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. In the Pacific, our military continues to fall behind a stronger China. Beijing is conducting the largest military buildup in human history, and at the same time they're flying spy balloons over our skies. Yet the response of Biden, Harris, and their rubber stamp off Casey has been to send senior officials to China to bow to the Chinese Communist Party, while China undermines our economy and our security every single day. And on Vice President Harris and Senator Casey's watch, America has forfeited its military might. An independent bipartisan commission, which was created to evaluate the state of our national security, recently concluded the U.S. military lacks both the capabilities and the capacity required to deter and prevail in combat. Let me stop there. The U.S. military lacks the capabilities and capacity required to be confident it can deter and prevail in this is the United States of America, a bipartisan commission. Last year, China's Navy added 30 new ships. We fielded 2. Yet this year, the Biden-Harris defense budget proposes shrinking, that's right, shrinking the size of the United States Navy by retiring more ships than it buys. And in response to China's growing technological innovation, that same commission said that the Pentagon is, and I quote, ossified, risk-averse organization. That organization is failing to build and field the military that America needs for the 21st century. And we can't talk about security without talking about here at home. Border Czar Harris and Senator Casey have created a wide-open southern border that allows fentanyl and illegal immigrants to surge into our country. And to put this in perspective, more than 4,000 Pennsylvanians died last year from fentanyl. 100,000 die every year from fentanyl overdoses. 100,000, right? That's almost twice as many who were killed during Vietnam in 8 years of war. 53,000 killed in Vietnam in 8 years of war. 100,000 killed last year by the cartels coming across the border and distributing fentanyl into our communities across Pennsylvania. This is an incredible national security challenge. Now finally, our national sense of purpose is being undermined by radical ideological agendas that inculcate a culture of weakness. Any military officer can tell you that time is their most precious resource. Yet advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion have now taken center stage at the expense of military might. Just to put this in perspective, during the first year of the Biden-Harris administration alone, our military spent nearly 6 million man-hours on DEI training and a stand-down to discuss extremism. It's no exaggeration to say that on Bob Casey's watch, there are parts of our Pentagon that are more focused on advancing DEI than winning wars. And no wonder the Army, Navy, and Air Force have missed their recruiting targets last year. This is a far cry from the incredible military I served in, and you served in 35 years ago, where the binding of lethality, meritocracy, and diversity were a source of strength that we all loved and respected. In a sane world, our leaders in Washington will be working around the clock to answer the call of history. But in Biden and Casey's Washington, they're asleep on the job. Harris and Casey would rather spend hundreds of billions of dollars to make America more dependent on China for green technologies than invest in the weapons and the support our brave service members need to defend our nation. And so we cannot, we must not, we will not accept this state of affairs. That's where we are today. And I wanted to take the time to describe it because the stakes are so high and the risk is so significant. Now looking forward, after more than 20 years as a leader in the private sector, I know a turnaround situation when I see one. That's what this is. And solving these massive problems to restore our national security requires shock therapy in our nation's capitals. And it requires retiring weak politicians, weak leaders, weak generals who have helped create this mess. First and foremost, we need to rebuild our military power. As a member of President Trump's Defense Policy Board, I saw firsthand what it looked like to prioritize military strength. And we need to do that again with strong leadership. And the blueprint is really clear. This isn't hard to figure out what we need to do. Senator Roger Wicker, who is the Senate's top defense leader, has a plan to build out the military that actually deter the threats we face around the world, and in the process strengthen our defense industrial base. It's a very critical part of it. It's our defense industrial base. I applaud and endorse his vision, especially his recognition that America must once again become the arsenal of democracy. At the height of World War II, Pennsylvania pumped out as much steel as all the Axis powers combined. We must recapture that productive capacity. If we want to deter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, for example, we have to have enough missiles forward deployed to sink the communist invasion fleet in the Taiwan Strait. And we must have the ability to replenish those missiles quickly after the shooting starts. Right now, our defense industrial base is woefully small and weak. We must make the hard choices necessary to rebuild it now. And these investments won't be cheap. But I've seen what war looks like, and I guarantee you it's cheaper to deter a war than to fight one. And let's be clear, an investment in our defense industrial base is an investment in American workers. Expanding facilities like Scranton's Army Ammunition Depot, which produces tens of thousands of artillery shells every month, creates good-paying jobs for American workers. It would restore Pennsylvania's storied position as freedom's forge. And given the problems facing the U.S. Navy, we need a SHIPS Act. A SHIPS Act that would make historic investments in American shipbuilding, technologies, and the workers that would make it happen. This legislation, which I will focus on day one, would expand our shipyards with Philadelphia at the top of the list to meet the needs of the Navy and the Merchant Marine. And this plan would create union jobs right here in Pennsylvania and treat our shipbuilding workforce as a strategic asset, not a dying trade. Second, it won't be enough just to invest more. We must get more with each and every taxpayer dollar. To do that, we'll have to change the way the Pentagon does business. As a business leader, it was my responsibility to set the vision, get the right team in place, move fast enough to stay ahead of our competitors. We got to do the same thing within our Pentagon. There's no time to rest on our laurels. As the saying goes, and this is true for our military, we need to adapt or die. And people's jobs and the return of our investors depended on the decisions I made. The same is true in national defense. America's ability to out-innovate our adversaries is one of our greatest assets. But a generation of misplaced priorities has paralyzed our Pentagon. Simply put, America's military must learn to innovate again. And that means we have to invest in cutting-edge technologies to ensure our servicemen and women are armed for the fight of the future, and innovate on top of existing weapons platforms to get the most bang for taxpayer bucks. But more than anything, we need new political leadership that will build a culture of innovation in our military services and drive fundamental change. The next Secretary of Defense must focus every day on rebuilding American power and promoting officers who have an unshakable focus on what it will take to fight and win our nation's wars. Personnel is policy, and you can only win with the right leadership in place. And finally, and this is probably most important, we must restore the sense among us all, and particularly in our kids, that America's worth fighting for. America's worth fighting for. Ronald Reagan's first Secretary of State, George Shultz, described Reagan's guiding principle during the Cold War as be strong. Be strong. Being strong, he explained, just doesn't mean military strength and economic strength. No, you need to have self-confidence and strength of purpose in our country. So it's not just military strength and economic strength. It's confidence and strength of self-purpose. I fear we're losing that strength of purpose. The American spirit fills our national character with courage, ambition, creativity. It is our source of strength when times get bad. And it's a defining characteristic. It's what makes us different than the rest of the world. It's what makes America exceptional. Yet far too many Americans have been fed a narrative of victimhood that puts grievance, not leadership and strength, first. Now our all-volunteer military is in peril because fewer and fewer young Americans are inculcated with a sense of patriotism and purpose. The patriotism and purpose that inspired me and you and my fellow West Pointers to serve. We need new leaders to cultivate the American spirit and restore institutional integrity. In the Pentagon, put warfighting and deterrence first. In schools, teach civics and America's exceptional story. In business, reaffirm the principles of merit and capitalism. And across our society, create a new national commitment to citizenship. It bears repeating that not since the Cold War's darkest days, of the Cold War, have Americans confronted such serious threats to their security, to your security, to your well-being, to our way of life. And never has America's superpower status been more in doubt. What's missing is leadership. What's missing is an honest reckoning of the forces arrayed against us and the urgent steps needed to ensure peace through strength and strength through prosperity. Now, I've heard the skeptics, there's plenty of them, who say it's time for America to give up the burden of being a superpower and become a normal nation. We're not strong enough. they say. They claim America isn't cut out for global leadership anymore. They're wrong. America's not like other nations, and it never should be. America is exceptional, but we need leaders with faith in our exceptionalism, and the will to fight for it. Global politics is a messy business. President Trump understood that. He recognized that our enemies speak one language, the language of power, and under his leadership, America did not enter any new wars. He put China on notice, and he used military power selectively to restore deterrence in the Middle East and defeat ISIS. He got our allies to pay for their fair share while working with them to make all of us more secure. That's what peace through strength looks like. When I think about all the problems our country faces, I try to remember all the problems we've overcome. I think about morning in America under President Reagan and the end of the Cold War. I think about Americans answering, many Pennsylvanians, answering the call of service in World War II. And I think about the blood spilled right here in our Commonwealth to give our nation a new birth of freedom, as Abraham Lincoln said. I'll never forget etched into my brain, never forget doing a parachute jump with my parents looking on over the hallowed ground of Gettysburg when I was a young lieutenant in the 82nd Airborne. Restoring American strength will require experienced and bold leadership to take on the Harris-Casey weakness that's undermined us and put our national security at risk. Pennsylvania needs a strong leader in the Senate who will work to restore American strength. That's who I am, and that's what I'll do with your great support in November. Thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate it.